Hi everybody, I'm Lawrence Todd at Design 911 and today I'm going to be giving you a tech talk on clutches. Now, a clutch is a critical part of your car's drivetrain and it can be found in between your engine and your gearbox. Without one, you'd have a pretty hard time changing gear. So what does your clutch do? Well, in essence, a clutch is like a switch. When your clutch is engaged and the switch is on, it allows the rotation of your engine to be transferred through to the input shaft of your gearbox. When the switch is off and your clutch is disengaged, then the rotation from your engine cannot pass through the clutch to the input of your gearbox. So what makes up a clutch? Now, a clutch has a number of different components. There's not really just, a clutch isn't just one thing. There are a number of different components that make up your clutch. And it starts with a flywheel. Now, this flywheel is bolted to the end of the crankshaft. And on the flywheel, there is a clutch friction face. So this is the first component of your clutch. The next component is something called a friction plate. See, this friction plate would work against the friction plate on the flywheel here. And there's something else about this friction plate, is that it's actually got a splined hub on it. Now, this spline hub engages with the primary shaft of your gearbox. Like this. So the flywheel is connected to the crank and the friction plate is connected to the primary shaft of the gearbox. If I just take this off, so this friction plate is sitting on the flywheel here. The third component of a clutch is something called a pressure plate. This pressure plate also bolts to the flywheel and it sandwiches between the flywheel and the pressure plate. This pressure plate, like the flywheel, has another friction surface. Once this pressure plate is bolted to the flywheel, there's a spring on it which basically clamps the friction plate between both the flywheel and the pressure plate. This assembly is what your clutch is like in its natural state and your clutch is engaged. Because the spring on the pressure plate is clamping the friction plate between the two, as your engine rotates, the friction plate also rotates with that assembly. As the friction plate is splined to the input shaft of your gearbox, the gearbox also rotates. Now, the fourth component of your clutch is something called a clutch release bearing. Now, you get two different types of operation of clutch. You get a pull type clutch and a push type clutch. And what that basically means is how this clutch pressure plate is being actuated. So the release bearing, in this case, this is a 915 gearbox off Porsche, used from 72 to 86. It was the most widely used gearbox on the Porsche range. In this case, this gearbox has a pull type clutch and this is a pull type release bearing. The release bearing actually assembles onto the pressure plate. That's not always the case. On earlier gearboxes, the release bearing, also known as a thrust bearing, because it was a push type gearbox, was actually separate. But then as times developed, it became one. And this actually assembles on to the pressure plate. So in this pull type gearbox, you have this pull type release bearing. What it's doing is there's a fork in the bell housing of your gearbox, basically engages in this groove on the release bearing. And the release bearing, as I said, is assembled to the pressure plate. When you engage your clutch, it is pulled forward, which basically releases pressure on this spring. In doing that, this friction face on the pressure plate is retracted backwards, which unclamps the friction plate between the flywheel and the pressure plate, allowing the gearbox input shaft to rotate independently from the rotation of the gearbox. Let me just quickly show you how it works on this gearbox. Okay, so this gearbox, it already has a release bearing assembled onto it. So I'm just going to take this off so you can see what's happening. So this is the fork that I was talking about. As you operate your clutch, so you put your foot on the clutch, this basically moves out. So that is its position in essence when your foot is off the clutch, and then you depress your clutch pedal, and either through hydraulics or cable, this gets pulled outwards. You can imagine this release bearing, which has that groove, these little forks mate with that groove. That's it assembled. So that would be it in its engaged position with your foot off the clutch, and then you depress your clutch pedal and it's pulling that release bearing towards the nose of the gearbox, which decompresses that spring on the pressure plate, moving this surface backwards, unclamping the friction plate. We've got a hydraulic press, so we're going to put one of these pressure plates on the hydraulic press and basically push down on the spring so that you can see how that friction surface on the pressure plate retracts. Okay, so this is the pressure plate in a hydraulic press. Try and show you what's happening when you depress your clutch and the release bearing is pulled by the yoke in the bell housing of your gearbox. So what we've done is, to replicate the pull of the release bearing, we're actually going to use the hydraulic press to push the release bearing down towards the floor. So by applying some pressure, I've also put some tape on the back here to try and show you the difference in height between the clamping friction surface. So as the release bearing is pulled with your foot on the clutch, this would happen a lot faster, obviously, but in essence, the release bearing pulls this surface back. So you now see the difference in height. That unclamps the friction plate, allowing it to rotate independently of the engine. And then when you take your foot off the clutch, the release bearing goes back to its natural state, reclamping the friction plate. To try and show you the difference between a push and a pull type clutch operation, I've got here a 996 pressure plate, which is a push type. The best way to show you this is actually to apply the force to the housing, which in essence pushes the springs in like your release bearing would be. So now if you watch this friction surface, as I apply pressure on this hydraulic press, this friction surface is actually going to drop down with respect to this mounting face of the pressure plate on the flywheel. That would be the clutch with your foot fully depressed on the clutch pedal. And if you just watch around about where my finger is as I release this hydraulic press, which would be the same as me releasing my clutch and re-engaging the clutch in essence, this friction plate is going to move upwards in respect to this kind of surface, which would then reclamp the friction plate and again engaging your clutch so that the drive of the engine translates to the gearbox. Now, unfortunately, your clutch, it is a wearing component, and you may be all too familiar of hearing that either your clutch is gone or one of your mates' clutch has gone. It's anticipated or it's expected that the life of a clutch is anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000 miles, and I know that is a huge range, but it really, really depends on your style of driving and the environment you're driving in. If you don't have to change gear very often, maybe you live in a very, very flat place, then you'll get much more miles out of your clutch. Fortunately, there are some telltale signs that can help you identify which element of your clutch may be giving up the ghost. So if you're getting some vibrations through your clutch pedal when you depress the clutch, this is a sign that your clutch release bearing could no longer be doing its job. Now, if you're getting other symptoms, so maybe you're finding it difficult to change gear because your clutch isn't disengaging, that's a sign that your pressure plate, again, may not be working properly. It's not unclamping the friction plate, allowing your gearbox to rotate independently from the engine, making it hard to select a new gear. If that is the case, as I said, it's likely that the pressure plate needs replacing. A third symptom of a worn out clutch is if your clutch is slipping. So a sign of a clutch slipping is if you increase your engine revs, but you don't actually get any drive, the increase in rotation of your engine isn't being translated to a rotation of the input shaft on your gearbox. And that is because friction plate is no longer providing that needed friction between your flywheel and your pressure plate. So if your clutch is slipping a lot, it may be that the friction surface on your friction plate has worn out. Maybe it's become too thin and you need to upgrade the friction plate. A final sign that your clutch may be on its way out is smell. Clutches, when they burn, they really stink, and that can be a sign that your clutch is about to give up. When you're looking at buying replacement parts for your clutch, you can either buy a clutch kit or individual elements. Now, there are two different types of clutch kits, and there's a 3-piece kit and there's a 2-piece kit. No clutch kits include the flywheel. It's very rare that you have to actually change the flywheel. If you do, you would just buy that independently. Okay, so if you do need to replace a component or the entirety of your clutch, what are your options? There is actually an opportunity to upgrade the components of your clutch. Sachs comes as both Sachs standard clutches, and Sachs also makes a Sachs performance clutch. Who is Sachs? Sachs is the manufacturer of clutches on behalf of Porsche. So when you buy a Porsche original clutch, that is actually being manufactured by Sachs. And when you buy an OEM clutch, that will come in a Sachs box. I'm going to be talking specifically about the upgrades here for a 915 clutch, but depending on what car you have, there will be equivocal kind of upgrades that you can look at for your car. So starting with Sachs standard, if you need to change your pressure plate, you can just go for a direct replacement. This is what would be found in the 915 from factory. And likewise, you can get a direct replacement friction plate. Now, in addition to these two, Sachs also makes an upgraded pressure plate. This is still Sachs standard, but it is a slight upgrade. Now, it uses exactly the same material here for the pressure plate friction surface, but the housing of this pressure plate is actually machined from billet aluminium compared to being cast from steel. That gives this clutch pressure plate a significant advantage in that it is significantly lighter than that clutch. What does that do? You might have heard of people lightening their flywheels. It has the same effect. This is obviously bolted to your flywheel. It lightens that rotating assembly, so it reduces the inertia of the rotating assembly, allowing your car to be much more freely revving. If you're pretty familiar with stalling your car, or you often stall your car, this might not be an upgrade for you because, as I said, not only does it make it rev faster, it also causes your engine to slow down faster, so you may start stalling your car more often. Now, you can upgrade your clutch to Sachs performance, and there are a range of different upgrades. If you're just using your car on the road, an upgrade is, as I said, this pressure plate is still standard, but an upgrade that you can have is in the friction plate. Now, the difference between the performance friction plate and the standard friction plate is in both the friction surface. As you can see, the friction surfaces are different. This one, the performance plate, it has got a higher coefficient of friction, which can help cope with engines with greater torque. So if your engine has a lot more torque, there's less chance of your clutch from slipping. Another difference in these two clutches is the springs. First of all, not all pressure plates have these springs, so you may be able to get a pressure plate with them or not. What they do is they kind of take up the bite. These springs have a much lower coefficient of friction, which makes the clutch engagement a bit softer. These springs, as you can see, they're completely different in design. The coil kind of frequency is increased and the springs are actually thicker. These are much stiffer springs, so that the bite of the clutch is a little bit more aggressive. Now, if you have a race car or you track your car, there are some even better upgrades that you can make to your clutch. Sachs, in their performance range, they have made, again, an even more upgraded pressure plate. So this pressure plate, it has the same billet aluminium housing that this one has, but the key difference here is that the friction surface on this pressure plate has been heat treated. So this friction surface can withstand much higher temperatures. When you're using your car in a race or track kind of environment, you're changing gears a lot more often than you would be on the road. and as a result, your clutch gets a lot hotter. So this can withstand those greater temperatures. It will have much more endurance and won't degrade as fast as, say, this one would if you used this in a kind of race track heated environment. So that is the pressure plate upgrade that Sachs make for track or race use. They also make upgraded friction plates. Now, these are friction plates like those two at the front here, but they actually have a different name. These are actually referred to in industry as paddles, but they serve the same purpose. They're still splined, and these are what are engaged to the input shaft of your gearbox. The difference in design of these to a standard pressure plate is basically to have better bite when you engage the clutch, and the change in friction material is again to increase the coefficient of friction between the flywheel and your pressure plate. In addition to it having a different style of design with regards to that kind of circular feature, they also come both with springs like those pressure plates or without springs. Now the springs, they take up the bite when you engage your clutch. If you want to go full race mode, you get one with no springs. This will be really aggressive clutch engagement. So if you've been experiencing any of those symptoms that I talked about earlier about your clutch being worn out, or you've been told by your garage that an element of your clutch has worn out and you'd like to source the components yourself, at Design 911 you can source all of the components for your clutch regardless of what model car you've got. If you do want to replace an element of your clutch, whether that be all of the components or part of it, if you head to design911.com, at the top of the website, if you enter in your vehicle model and type and click go, and then head over to the left-hand side navigation menu and select gearboxes and transmission. You'll then be presented with a grid layout where you can either select clutch kits, these are the standard clutch kits, or you can click clutch kits high performance, and these have the upgraded components. Alternatively, if you're just looking to replace individual elements of your clutch assembly, you can select clutch friction plate, clutch pressure plate, clutch release bearings, respectively. If you have any questions, maybe you're not sure which upgrade would be most suitable for your car, don't hesitate to get in touch with the team at design911.com. Through the phone, drop them an email, or on the chat on the website. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.